Hello and welcome back to the podcast that is always up to speed with Formula One. It is Sunday night, August 29th. Hey, Mark, did you see that? See what? You're asking? Dude, that was your summer. Can you believe it? The summer is basically gone in the blink of an eye, just like the Belgian Grand Prix. We are now less than a week away from Labor Day, which is the unofficial end of summer in North America. And did you ever follow that old saying of no white pants after Labor Day? I don't know where I heard that. Good thing I don't own any white pants. But yeah, we had a Grand Prix today. It rained all weekend. They delayed the race for 3 hours. They did 2 laps behind the safety car. And then they red flagged it, awarded half points for the top 10 cars, which was basically, well, it was identical to the starting grid. And that was it. So thank you so much for downloading and listening to the show. If you want to get in touch, well, I'm just kind of kidding.
Great Grand Prix.
Wow.
Today.
Oh, wow. Yeah. Well, I guess it wasn't really a surprise based on what we saw over the course of the weekend, the inclement weather in the Ardennes in Belgium. And it was just, it was a safety issue. And sadly, it was the right thing to do. It's not really a great look for Formula One. It's bad PR, but it was a good call. I mean, it was just too dangerous. I mean, we saw so many crashes in Eau Rouge throughout the weekend, not just in Formula One, in the support series as well. That crash that we saw, I guess, on Saturday or Friday, whenever it was now in the W series, my God, that was scary. I still can't believe that they all walked away with basically just some bumps and bruises, because that was scary. And then when I saw Lando's car come apart like it did, at first I thought the worst, and I was really, really disturbed by all that. And unfortunately, that was about as good as the weather got.
Absolutely. It's crazy too, because if you flash back 2 weeks, we did a podcast with a friend of the show, Matt Sakaris, and he made and I don't know if it was necessarily a hot take or a throwaway comment, but he made mention of the fact that in his belief, Spa is simply too dangerous for the modern iteration of Formula One car, possibly any open wheel racing car, based, I think, what we saw the last couple of days. And I remember kind of stewing on that for the next couple of days, thinking like, I don't know if that's necessarily true. It's a high speed track. It's not super technical, but boy, did his comments resonate over the past couple of days, because to your point, we saw an ugly dust up in the FIA F3 support race. We saw an absolutely crushingly terrifying crash in the W Series support race. And of course, we saw that ugly Lando incident in Q3, right at the cusp, right at the beginning of Q3 of qualifying on Saturday. And to your point as well, that W Series crash was terrifying. And I obviously saw the clip, and I wasn't out looking for it. It wasn't something that we were going to retweet, at least not until we knew that people were safe and people were okay and people were going to be okay. But the reality is too, watching that clip once again, thank goodness for the halo. But for me, the entire theme of this weekend is ultimately safety. And I think, and we're going to spend quite a bit of time talking about this, but I think ultimately F1 fans, the folks that were there, the folks that were watching on TV, probably respected that we shouldn't have had a Grand Prix today. I think where people are ultimately upset and dissatisfied and frustrated is the charade of that 2 laps behind the safety car to force through a race classification so they could put some points on the board, call it a Grand Prix weekend, and move on. The reality is that's something that's probably going to live on as a particularly ugly mark and stain on the history of not only this championship, but of the sport moving forward. And while I don't think it necessarily lives in infamy or will live in infamy in quite the same way that the 2005 US Grand Prix did,
Yes.
Bad look. And I got up for this one because I've really taken to tweeting along with the race and engaging with people on social media during the Grand Prix. Historically, I didn't. Historically, I would, to your point, watch a recording later. But I got up this morning and it was about 5:45, 6 o'clock, and I posted a tweet of like, let's go. And we were excited for a wet race. But ultimately, 3.5 hours later, I left angry and frustrated and annoyed. And not because there wasn't a real Grand Prix, because the reality is the conditions wouldn't allow for it, but the fact that they shoved through a charade of a 2-lap race behind a safety car just so they could say, race complete, mission complete, let's go home. And at the end of the day, the people that are harmed, the people that are hurt ultimately are the fans at home and the fans that attended that race. Total disservice to Formula One fans everywhere.
Yeah, it's funny that you should make that comparison to the 2005 U.S. Grand Prix because this morning, and I was out on the bike. I was out for a ride, and it's been a quiet month for that particular pastime of mine. And I was trying to get in as many miles over the weekend as I could, and I thought, well, it's going to be good to go out for a ride first thing this morning. I'll come back, have breakfast, sit down, watch the Grand Prix on the on F1 TV live. And I got back to the car. It was about 9:30 Pacific time, 10 o'clock, whatever it was. Pull my phone out of the back of my cycling jersey, and the first message I see on the top is yours. It's just like, dude, don't even bother. They did 2 laps behind the safety car and they awarded half points. I told my brother, who's also a big Formula One fan, he's like, well, at least I don't have to go home and sit through 3 hours of that, hoping at some point that it's going to get going. But yeah, my immediate reaction was, until I go home and see some of this, is it going to be similar to the 2005 U.S. Grand Prix, which for those of you that weren't around or don't remember, that's when we had the Goodyear and the Bridgestone tires. The Goodyear runners, they basically withdrew from the race. They all did the formation lap, and coming out of the infield section at Indianapolis, they all peeled off. The Goodyear running cars, they all peeled off, went in the pits, and basically we had 6 cars start the Grand Prix. It was the 2 Ferraris and 4 other guys. I can't even remember which other teams were running. And it's burned into my memory that the fans at Indy standing up, thumbs down, booing, and of course it was a terrible look. I mean, this is a bad look as well, but I mean, with the right intentions. Like you say, it was this whole charade of getting the cars out there like something was going to happen. I mean, if you go and listen to the race call, or the way that it's going on pardon me, on Sky Sports, is that there's something's going to happen. They're talking about being behind the pace car, or sorry, the safety car. And Martin Brundle and Crofty are both saying, well, the best way to dry a car for Formula One car, or dry a track for Formula One cars, is to get some Formula One cars out there and help repel the water off there, and everything that they did. And it obviously just did not work at all, which was yeah, it was a charade. But
Absolutely. And one
what
of the
else do you do in the circumstances?
Yeah, and I think this is where my opinions really evolved over the course of the day. And one of the terms that was being thrown around quite liberally this morning was farce, farce, farce. This is a farce. This is a farce. And initially, I was struggling to decouple the 3.5 hours that led up to the quote unquote race from the race itself. And to me, I'm like, well, the FIA's here. They're effectively the operations manager. They're here and they're concerned for safety. Ultimately, this was an ugly race from a conditions perspective. It was an absolute torrential downpour. We shouldn't have raced. We didn't race, et cetera, et cetera. But then as the day went on and I started reflecting back on this, I'm like, okay, I kind of get it. The FIA was delaying and delaying and delaying, and they stopped the clock and they restarted the clock because I think in their spirits, in their thought process, they wanted to give this race every possible opportunity to happen. If the weather allowed, they wanted to create an opportunity. So they let it go, they let it go, they paused the clock, they let it go. And I'm thinking, you know what, that makes sense. I appreciate that. You've got a global TV audience. Everyone is super hyper hungry for a Formula One race. We finished the first half of the calendar on a bit of a cliffhanger where Lewis and Mercedes had leapt past Red Bull and Max Verstappen. Suddenly we have this championship. Everyone's sitting back for 4 weeks, hungry for Formula One to return. People were incredibly excited. We go into this race weekend. It's not looking good on Sunday. The rain's coming. It's not letting up. I think the FIA was pushing and pushing and pushing because they wanted there to be an opportunity. That opportunity didn't come. I think where the frustration really comes from is not the chaos and the confusion and the lack of communication in those 3.5 hours, but rather the fact that they forced a Grand Prix into 2 laps behind a safety car. If the conditions weren't safe, call it. Do not host what is ultimately, and now I do totally agree, and my opinion has changed, a farce of a Grand Prix, because that's what it was. Do not challenge the intellectual capability of Formula One fans, new or old. That is garbage. And if I was a fan at the race and if I was a fan at home, which I was, I'm super, super frustrated. You've done them all a disservice. I don't know about you, but my opinions have evolved as the days gone on. And initially I was like, I get it. It's okay. Take the points. Let's move on. It's the championship. Now, as far as that 2-lap race behind a safety car, I'm pretty angry. I'm a pretty frustrated consumer today.
Yeah, I was pretty irritated about it, but I mean, let's go and see what your namesake and seven-time world champion Lewis Hamilton had to say. And he'd said some things before the race on social media, saying that it was too dangerous to go out. It was going to put all the drivers at risk. He was in the media pen after the quote unquote. I'm doing the inverted commas here. The quote unquote race. Anyways, Lewis had to say money talks, and it was literally the 2 laps to start the race. It's all money scenario. So everyone gets their money, and I think the fans should get theirs back too, because unfortunately they didn't get to see what they came and paid for. It's a shame we can't do the race tomorrow, but yeah, and I love this track as well. I'm so sad we couldn't do this, but today wasn't a race. I think the sport made a bad choice today. Of course, we wanted to race. There's a minimum of 2 laps that you need to do to count as a race. And between that gap of stopping the first time to the second time, it had rained consistently. There's only one reason they sent us out, and that's why I feel more bad for the fans, end quote. So, I think he's spot on. I mean, obviously, I would be more than a little bit salty right now had I stumped up all the cash to make the trip, regardless if it was only an hour or two in the car or if I come from the other side of the world with airfare and track ticket and hotel and all that. Yeah, it is just not a good look for Formula One. Now, CEO of Formula One, Stefano Domenicali, said that there was no commercial pressure to start the race today. He said, quote, no, at the end of the day, that's why when I hear that there was some sort of commercial discussion behind that, it's totally not true, because when we're talking about racing, there is responsibility. That is a clear process, and those things are not connected at all. And he went on to say, when he was asked if F1 would also receive its full sanctioning fee without having a quote unquote race, even if it was only 2 laps long, he went on to say, quote, absolutely. That is why I said to consider that as something related to a commercial implication is wrong, end quote. So,
okay. I got to interject here.
Go for it.
And I probably shouldn't because it's rude, but I totally agree with Lewis Hamilton. And if Lewis Hamilton had made this comment under the Bernie Eccleston era, there would have been a hellstorm, an absolute hellstorm. So I respect the fact that Lewis now operates.
What do you mean, like blowback from the F1 side, or from Bernie specifically?
From Bernie, well,
okay.
Could you really disentangle Formula One and Bernie when
no, of course not.
Show?
Yeah,
but I think it would have been an ugly scenario, and I think Liberty gives the drivers a little bit more freedom when it comes to speaking their mind. But kudos to Lewis, and this is where I'm very confused. I would like to know what data points the FIA had immediately before sending those cars out. What was changing in the weather patterns? What suddenly changed in the last 3.5 hours that they believed, okay, now is the point that we can put these cars out with the expectation that we could have a Grand Prix? Because I don't think there were any data points suggesting that it was possible to have a Grand Prix. I think they were pushed out. And this is where I'm frustrated, because from an FIA perspective, their principal role here is to manage the operations of the Grand Prix, to manage the safety. I don't know that they necessarily care if there's a classification or not. So the perception is, of course, that Liberty pushed the FIA to ensure that we could get a classification so we could close the book on the Grand Prix. Because to that point from Domenicali, the reality is, as long as there's a Grand Prix and a race classification, they get the money from the TV networks. So they get to keep that cash. The terms and the conditions from the tickets sold through the race organizer get locked in. Hey, a Grand Prix happened. We've satisfied the terms of the tickets that we've sold. And then ultimately, of course, the sanctioning fee from the race organizer itself becomes concrete, because again, we've hosted a Grand Prix. We've lived up to our side of that contractual arrangement. So from Liberty's perspective, they're good. They're scot-free. They wipe their hands of this. They move on to Zandvoort. So I think the perception is a really bad one. And I like the fact that Hamilton's making this comment that ultimately, look, these fans that showed up were absolutely incredibly loyal and sat around in the rain for not the 3.5 hours that it took from the moment the Grand Prix was supposed to start, but for the 2 or 3
3.5 days.
Yeah, the 3.5 days. And I think Lewis's comments are great. And I also found it was really telling that Dominicali was specifically asked about Lewis's comments and said, "Hey, what do you think about refunding the fans?" He's like, "No, no, 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 no. We're not refunding the fans." Now, the race organizer, they can refund the fans if they want to, but then the race organizers out a sanctioning fee and the refunds to fans. As far as I'm concerned, I think that this whole refund situation could become more problematic than the perception of a terrible 2-lap Grand Prix. If F1 lets this linger, it could be a really bad mark on an organization that's made so many great inroads in terms of building and nurturing and cultivating a great fan base. My perspective is this: you know what, Mr. Race Organizer, go ahead, refund those tickets. And if I'm Liberty, I'm going to waive the 2021 sanctioning fee. You know what? You guys didn't get a Grand Prix. We want to have a healthy long-term relationship with you. We don't want to burn you. We're going to waive it. And ultimately, that's going to mean there's going to be slightly less prize money at the end of the season for the teams that qualify for championship prize money. But I think the teams would probably be okay with that based on the feedback that we heard from people like Zach Brown and Sebastian Vettel and Lewis Hamilton.
Yeah, ultimately, I think it comes down to what the bean counters tell the F1 bigwigs in the boardroom and what they decide to do. But I think
So
what you say, I think, is completely reasonable, and I think it's absolutely the right thing to do. I did have a couple other things I wanted to respond to in that whole little tirade rant of yours, but it's all good. And we'll take a quick break. We'll come back on the flip side, and I'll address those points. So don't go away after this. Just for this short message from our sponsors. All right. Well, welcome back to the show. It's well, it was usually kind of a race weekend recap kind of show. I don't know what the hell this show is tonight, but we'll make it into something. We got tons of emails, but it was interesting. One of the things I wanted to address that you said in the previous segment was just all these data points about when they could or could not have actually got this race going at some point on Sunday afternoon. And I thought it was interesting because, full disclosure, I opened up the F1 TV app. I knew that there was going to be a 3-hour delay, so I scrolled all the way through. I mean, come on, who's going to sit there and listen to 3 hours of people talk about Formula One? Nobody does that.
No one does. Kudos to Crofty and Brundle, by the way.
Oh, 100%.
3.5-hour block of watching rain fall in Belgium.
They should be. I don't know how they get paid, salary or hourly. If they're hourly, they should be getting double or triple time because they did an amazing job. And I was just being a little bit kind of sarcastic about people who sits around and talks about Formula One. It's kind of the whole thing that we do here. But anyways, joking aside, but it was interesting because when I kind of went a little bit too far and I dialed it back a little bit. And I noticed at one point when the cars were behind the safety car was that they were talking about, okay, well, it seems like the rain has picked up again. And it looks like that the window of opportunity that they had to run a race looked like it had come and gone. And the rain had picked up and it was harder than it was at any point in the afternoon before that. So I guess when you're sitting there at the track, maybe the rain did ease off, but obviously they weren't in the position to react, or they just decided that they weren't going to. Maybe they're looking at the weather radar. Maybe they're thinking, okay, in 30 minutes, we're going to have no rain or something, but it came and gone, and it's a bit of a moot point at any rate. But yeah, I mean, just going back to the other point that you were making about waiving the sanctioning fee for next year. I mean, they should totally do that. I mean, and the people, they deserve their money back. I mean, you pay hundreds or thousands of bucks to get a race ticket. It doesn't matter if you get like the entire weekend or if you just go for race day or one of the days thereof. But I mean, especially for the people that braved it out all weekend and then especially braved it out over 3.5, 4 hours, whatever it was on Sunday, only have to sit there behind that sham of a race for 15, not even that, less than 10 minutes. Is it's beyond the pale, right? I mean, if they're not giving people their money back or freebies to next year, however they want to comp people for next year, you got to do something because it's just it's a terrible look otherwise.
I'll just add one thing on that too. I found it really offensive that Dominicali's response is no, that the sanctioning fee is locked in. It's up to the race organizer if they want to do something. I just want to be very clear that these race circuits and these race organizers themselves, typically live on the head of a pin in terms of finances. These aren't these races are very lucrative for Formula One. They are very, very, very difficult to host in a way that's financially viable. And these tracks themselves often live on the precipice of bankruptcy. So if the race organizer was themselves to refund millions of dollars worth of tickets, there's a very real possibility that the race organizer itself could go into administration or go into some form of bankruptcy. Like, these aren't typically billion-dollar companies that are hosting these events. Typically, it's a local tourism-based organization. It's a local telecom company. I found that comment from Dominicali despicable. And I like Dominicali, and I think he's adding some real value to Formula One, but I found that very, very, very frustrating.
100%. And I'm going to get a little bit kind of silly now, and I have to admit that at one point I feel like we should have opened the show here this evening with Milli Vanilli and Blame It on the Rain. And I know that we are very careful here not to play anything that's copyrighted, anything that we don't have the rights or permissions to. But I feel that when it's Milli Vanilli, they're frauds, and we should be able to. I mean, they're proven as frauds, so I feel like we should be able to play their music without repercussion. But I think there's sort of a double meaning to it. I mean, they were frauds. Their music was all lip synced and sung by other people. But I mean, Blame It on the Rain seems like the perfect song to play for a bit of a fraud of a Grand Prix. So I think it has kind of a double meaning to it. But it was interesting too, looking at some of the comments from race director Michael Massey. I mean, hey, it's been like a couple of weeks. We haven't heard him comment about things. We were commenting, hey, he's way too much in the news, but
he's not popular online. Right
well, I can understand why, but this is one time I'm kind of interested to hear his 2 cents, because we've all seen it in IndyCar. We've seen it with NASCAR, where they have rain delays and postponements and stuff like that, and they'll actually end up running the race on another day. So Michael Massey came out and said that they had no ability whatsoever to postpone the race from today until tomorrow. I know we're going to be at Zandvoort next week, but come on, let's face it. This is a couple hours. Even to get to all the cars there, buy all the trucks and all the freight and stuff like that. Yeah, it would be obviously a bit of a logistical challenge, but it's not like we're going from Spa to Abu Dhabi or somewhere like that in less than a week. So I don't know why they could not make something work. But anyways, he has to say, or he had the following to say, quote, "There's no ability to postpone the race until tomorrow. So obviously from the FIA perspective and jointly with F1, safety is paramount for the drivers, the team, and all of the spectators. We gave every available opportunity within the rulebook and the provisions of the International Sporting Code to give us the best opportunity for us to complete a race. Unfortunately, on this occasion, we could not go the full distance that was available, but with the provisions to stop the clock is what we tried to do to see if we could get ourselves in that weather window of some activity." End quote. Carlos Sainz said that running behind the car or behind the safety car was just to get a result was absolute nonsense. And Massey went on to say that, anyways, we know what he said, but I don't know. The more that I read about this, I kind of see, and I say this, somebody that comes from European background and has European family. I've lived there, but I just find that this is kind of an old world way of looking at things. It's way too tangled in the rules and the sporting code and things like that. Whereas we have the saying here in North America where, the customer is always right. And it doesn't matter who seems to be saying it, like one of the, you know, the powers that be, it seems that they're using like any excuse that they can or any reason that they can from the rules or the provisions in the International Sporting Code or whatever it is to try and explain away why they couldn't got this race run today or postponed and run at another time. So, I just get frustrated like that, because at the end of the day, it's the fans that end up paying for it, and paying for it literally in a couple of ways, especially the people that were there. They're paying out of their own pocketbook to partake in a Grand Prix that was just an absolute joke, right?
I can anticipate some of the text messages or DMs we're going to get after this podcast. So I just want to
yeah, for sure.
something. Let's be crystal clear that neither you or I are suggesting or advocating for the fact that this race should have happened. We
No.
both agree that it was absolutely the right thing not to race this Grand Prix. But if the conditions weren't suitable to run a Grand Prix, why did we go through that charade, that farce of 2 laps behind a safety car to lock in the race classification? That is where I am frustrated. Again, I totally agree. There shouldn't have been a Grand Prix today. I'm very happy that the FIA stretched this out as long as they could in the hopes that the skies would open up. They might be able to run a race that's less dangerous. That didn't happen. But because the conditions were so bad, it's galling that they would run that 2 laps behind a safety car just so they could cash in on all of the revenue associated with closing the books on a weekend Grand Prix.
And I think it's interesting too, because I mean, you're sitting here, guys, you're listening to 2 guys from Vancouver. We live in the Pacific Northwest. We know when it comes to talking about like bad weather and rain, believe me, we know what we're talking about. And if we're looking at it and saying, holy crap, that is raining hard, it was raining hard. So, it's, and totally, I mean, I agree with you 100%, Mark, that's the stance that we're taking was that they shouldn't have run this, or they should have run this race in the conditions no matter what, because obviously it was the right call not to. But I would agree with you. I think it's a worse look for them to have run this charade of a Grand Prix for 2 laps behind the safety call, rather than saying, okay, you know what, we can't run the race at all. We're just going to wipe it from the books. Nothing's going to be awarded. It's just it's not held. I think that, I mean, people would have been upset, but I think that this attempt to try and get something done just for the sake of it and getting a race classification. I mean, go back to 1984, Monaco. That's one of the races I remember watching as a young kid. Similar torrential, horrible conditions. I seem to remember Alain Prost leading that race. This is the era when maybe race radios, there was maybe communications or the pits, or it was just in his infancy. I remember him waving, gesticulating furiously every time he went by start finish. And they ended up calling that race. Senna, I think, was still racing for Lotus, or was it Tolman at the time? I can't. Maybe it was before he even went to Lotus. He ended up. I think if that race had gone a couple of laps longer, that was kind of one of his, basically his coming out party, and just proved what a great driver he was in the rain. But anyways, they ran it. I think they got to about 50% race distance, and they awarded half points. So, I mean, if you want to postpone or call the race in that condition, sure. I mean, that was pretty horrible in terms of inclement weather that day as well. But at least there was a proper race going on. I mean, they started it, and they decided, you know what, guys, it's not safe to go. And I mean, this is in the 80s, and face it, the 80s, anything went. So it had to be pretty bad if they called it at this time. So,
and just to add, and I got to stop doing this because I have a bad habit of continuing to add on to points that you add on to my points, which are an add on to a previous point that you made. But
it's like the club sandwich of podcasting,
I like that analogy. I think the fans would have understood, especially after what we saw in the W Series pile up, especially with what we saw at the beginning of Q3 with Lando taking a spin, and especially with what we saw in the F3 event. I think the fans would have understand that out of an abundance of caution, we are not going to run this Grand Prix. The problem is, it looks like all of a sudden you cannot disentangle the FIA and the commercial interests of Liberty and Formula One, which are always supposed to be 2 completely independent, sovereign bodies from one another. It's a bad look. 2 other quick comments that I'm just going to add here real quick before we move on. One, I saw a great comment on Reddit suggesting that the Netflix X Mercedes curse returns. This is very much like the fiasco for Mercedes that was Germany in 2019. And then another interesting stat as well. This was the shortest Grand Prix run in the history of Formula One at 14 kilometers. The previous shortest Grand Prix was Australia in 1991 at Adelaide, which was 55 kilometers, which should help provide a little bit of perspective in terms of what it was that we saw in the blink of an eye today.
Yeah, you're not kidding. It really was a blink of an eye. But I mean, going back to what I was saying just now about like how bad the conditions were, if you saw the spray, I mean, you get that one camera, that great camera that they've had at Spa for eons at the end of the Kemmel Straight. I mean, we all remember that. You'll go back 20 years, Hakkinen and Schumacher going down there, both going on either side. I think it was Ricardo Zonta in the bar. and that camera was there, but you see the safety car coming and then nothing. It's just like a wall of spray. And then you see Max kind of like drifting out to the side, because at least if he pulls over to one side or the other of the safety car, at least he can see. But can you imagine you're the guy? Can you imagine you're Sergio Perez? You're starting at the back of the pack. I mean, it was just, it was incredible. Anyways, Mark, time for another quick break here on the show. When we come back, I guess we should kind of maybe talk about one or two other things in the to do with this, quote unquote Grand Prix. We'll do that in just a moment. So, guys, don't go away. We'll be right back. Okay, well, welcome back to the show. And would it be, we were saying how galling it was for them to go out and run this, charade of a Grand Prix for 2 laps behind the safety car. Would it be equally galling if we read out the top 10, like the race classification, or should we just do it? Should we do it? You're not. I'm not sure. We should.
It would be no less galling to having a podium celebration like they did today. So I think we should run through the race classification.
Okay, well, I'll just be straight up. I mean, guys, we're not giving back any refunds. Not that we took any money in the first place, so we can't give back what we don't have. Anyways, that's right. Anyways, the race classification was Max Verstappen, George Russell. No, that is not a mistake. Lewis Hamilton rounding out the podium, I guess you could call it. Danny Ricciardo, Sebastian Vettel, Pierre Gasly, Esteban Ocon, Charles Leclerc, Nick Latifi, double points finish for the Williams. And I mean, come on, George Russell and Nick Latifi, these guys have been driving hard for the longest time to get.
And I know we've got a story coming up about Williams, so I've got a little bit for that. But
cool.
Yeah, back-to-back double points finishes for Williams.
I mean, I guess if you're Williams, you've had all these years of horrible luck and just poor performances. You'll take it any way that you can get it. And then finally, to round out the top 10, you had Carlos Sainz in the second of the 2 Ferraris. Now, looking at the driver's standings, it is kind of close things up a little bit. You have Lewis Hamilton still on top, 202.5 points. And come on, this is going to suck the rest of the year, reading out these decimals. I mean, we should just like round up.
I was just thinking the exact same thing.
So anyways, we got Lewis 202.5 points, Max Verstappen just 3 points behind with 199.5, Lando Norris 113, Valtteri Bottas 108, and then Sergio Perez rounding out the top 5 with 104. On the constructors side, of course, that's closed up a little bit too, but it's Mercedes still on top. Thank God it's kind of like balanced out with the half points. Anyways, 310 for Mercedes, 303 for Red Bull, 169 for McLaren, Mercedes, and then Ferrari now 4 points behind with 165, and Alpine rounding out the top 5 with 80. So, I mean, looking at the constructors, I mean, we were talking recently about Ferrari and McLaren. That's going to be pretty tight. Alpine and AlphaTauri, there's only 8 points separating the two. So those that sort of middle of the best of the rest, if you want to call it, those are going to be some interesting battles going down the stretch. So, anyways, going back to what we were just talking about just now. So George Russell, the man that came so close to scoring points and then having it cruelly yanked away from him and not getting the results that he really deserved at many times over the past couple of years, finished second today. I mean, let's give George credit. I mean, as silly as it is that to be celebrating a podium finish for George based on what happened on Saturday, you have to give him full credit for the performance he put in qualifying on very greasy, wet roads to stick it on the front row. So, I mean, give him props for that. Yeah, I think you got to put an asterisk beside the fact that it is his first podium, but he said it doesn't matter how his first F1 podium arrived. Yes, sure. I mean, if it's a confidence booster, I'm going to look at it more as a great qualifying for George, and then just a very, well, bizarre Sunday that worked out very well for him.
Yeah. I just want to say that I feel very much vindicated after qualifying and after George's podium. I feel like I've been living on an island for the past 6 months. I was the only person out there advocating for the greatness of George Russell. And hopefully, and shame on all of you for not believing and trusting in the greatness of George Russell, hopefully you can all see what I've clearly been preaching for the last 6 months, which is this guy is a future megastar, a superstar, and he absolutely deserves Valtteri's seat, which I think is probably going to be announced possibly by the time we do our next show. But again, I'm kidding. That's all very tongue in cheek. But again, I think that qualifying performance was an epic mega performance. And to put it into context, both he and Nicholas actually looked really great in Q1 and Q2. Nicholas almost squeezed into Q3, which would have been epic. We were almost in a position where we had two Williams in Q3 for the first time in I don't know how long. I think that obviously their team had done a phenomenal job in putting together their aero philosophy and their aero package for the weekend. It suited the track, it suited the conditions. Lando obviously spins at the beginning of Q3, and my wife and I were watching that session, and as far as we were concerned, we were shocked that the cars were released because the conditions were so bad, and we were commenting on it together when Lando crashed. And again, to your earlier point, it was one of those kind of tongue and throat moments where you're panicked and you're concerned for his well-being. And kudos obviously to Seb. Seb, moments before Lando spun, was screaming on the radio that.
Did you see or listen to the uncensored radio feed from Seb's? That was very yeah, very, very much so.
Absolutely. And I think a lot of people now believe that Seb should probably be running the FIA after his career is over. But ultimately, Lando spins. Fortunately, he's okay. He's deprived possibly of his first pole position because he was looking fantastic and that car was dialed in. Obviously, he's very upset about the way that points were distributed today. But when you got back to that truncated Q3 session, the cars didn't have a lot of time. And most of the cars went out straight on their full wets. They did a relatively slow lap to charge the batteries, and then they did an absolute flying lap to try to get to the best possible time. Williams took a different strategy. They actually sent George out on the wets, brought him in, threw him on inters, sent him out again, but he didn't have the same opportunity to go out and charge his batteries. So he's basically just sent out, and he put in an absolute blistering time. If not for the facts that Max pipped him at the last second, he would have been on pole. He finishes 0.3 of a second behind Max. It was fantastic. It's the first time that you've had a Williams car on the front row since Lance did it in the rain in 2017 at Monza, another incredibly famous, difficult to navigate track in the wets. It was also the first Williams podium, and I should reinforce this as well. Since, again, Lance Stroll put a Williams on the podium at Baku in 2017, but terrific weekend. I think the question then is, because there was a lot of comment about this week or today as well, is, and again, this obviously is in the sporting regulation, but if you can get through qualifying, but you can't run a Grand Prix, should you still distribute points? Or should points only be distributed at the conclusion of a Grand Prix? And I mean, unless they want to change the sporting regulation, I guess the points kind of moot. But again, all the praise in the world to George. I don't take away from him the podium. He put himself in a position where he was on the front row, and it wasn't anything that he did that resulted in a farce of a 2-lap race. So he deserves the podium. He deserves the points. Kudos to him. I just want to stress as well, and I've made this point a couple of times, is as much as he's evolving as a driver, and presumably Nicholas is as well, because we've seen a couple of stellar performances out of him recently, I think we need to make sure we continue to give credit to the Williams team, their factory, and their leadership, because the car that George is driving today is not the car from 2019 or 2020. They've continued to iterate and evolve that car. So again, as much as George is an up-and-coming superstar, as I've mentioned previously, the car itself has developed as well. And I just want to make sure that Williams as a whole get credit for that, because I see people constantly refer to it as a fire truck, a tractor, a bus. It's not. It's a Formula One car with a Mercedes power unit, and that team should be capable of doing some good things with it.
Okay, fair enough. I want to go into the mailbag now because we have an email here from Annie Erling. And this is interesting because it's a little bit counter to a few of the points that you just made. So she says, hello, Mark and Mark. I cannot stop thinking about George Russell's podium. Who knows what would have happened, but I'm pretty sure that Russell would not have been on the podium if a normal race had gone forward. Maybe I'm just grouchy about the 4 hours I wasted this morning, but Russell's performance in his Williams car was anomalous. It was very cool, but also deviating from what is normal. Fine, he got second in a really horrible farce of a race. Good for him and Williams, but it's making me crazy to hear the British media using language like, quote unquote, he earned it and praising his weekend performance. What? Maybe I'm wrong, and Russell truly had what has been described by the British F1 media as one for the history books and one of the best quality performances in the last decade. I would love to hear about Russell's Spa performance from the only non-British folks I follow for F1 news. Thanks, Annie, a proud member of the Generation DTS. Well, thanks for the email.
Thank you.
Yeah, I agree with. Yeah, I'll go first. I agree. I disagree with one point. I do agree that, well, maybe that's just a little bit of hyperbole. What the media is saying, that it was one of the best quality performances in the last decade. That might be a little bit too far. Definitely the qualifying performance of the weekend. Maybe the qualifying performance of the year to date, sticking it on the front row and not the greatest car on the grid in horrible conditions. I mean, he deserves and earns all the props for that. And as one for the history books, the podium and all that, and earning the podium again, being in the right place at the right time, because it, like Annie says, it is anomalous. It is an outlier. Under normal circumstances, unfortunately, we would have seen George dropping back through the race order pretty quickly. Same with Nicholas, and then hopefully maybe keeping one or both of those cars in the points later in the race. Thoughts?
I very much agree. I want to be clear as well. A couple of minutes ago, when I was talking about George and having been his principal advocate for the past 6 months, I was very much tongue in cheek. I think listeners to the show, and especially if you're joining the Spaces chat, know that I'm typically of the perspective that he's a very capable driver
Mhm.
whose talents will likely be greatly exaggerated and amplified if he gets the opportunity to rock that Mercedes car. And I don't necessarily know who should do it, if not he. I think Valtteri's run with that team is deservedly over based on some previous experiences and what he's been able to string together over the last 12 to 18 months. But
Sure.
I absolutely agree. And this is a comment that we hear from our listeners all the time, particularly our Gen DTS American listeners, is, oh my goodness, the British press just fawn over George Russell. And I think the frustrating thing is that he's put in some pretty tight performances in that car and he's getting a lot of credit this weekend. But I was very quick to temper that by reminding people that this team hasn't been sitting on their laurels for the past their laurels. They haven't been sitting on their hands for the past 2 years, allowing other teams to iterate on their car while they did nothing. They've been iterating and developing this car as well. And let's not forget they have a Mercedes power unit. So I think George is a very talented driver. I think he's going to score podiums when he finally makes his way to Mercedes. But I think given the opportunity, I don't know why people would believe that he would do better in an equally capable car than Charles Leclerc or Lando Norris or any of a variety of other young talented drivers. I think he's good and I think he's going to do well with Mercedes, but I think his performances may be amplified or exaggerated by the based on the fact that he's going to be in that car. Now, again, 2022 is going to be different because we're kind of resetting the formula entirely. So who knows what the teams look like. But again, I've been very, very conservative. I think he deserves praise for qualifying in borderline treacherous conditions yesterday. But I totally agree with your point that under normal conditions, there's no way he scores a podium this weekend. He might finish in the top 10. He'll score a couple of points. He'll be happy with that. But I
Mhm.
don't think it would be totally different than Lance in 2017 when he put the car in the front row in Monza and then finished seventh. I think it probably would have been a similar outcome.
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, I don't think there's any discussion or too much debate over the fact that he is an excellent driver when it comes to qualifying. I mean, he has that
Yes,
somewhat of
absolutely.
and I think it's well intentioned. I don't think it's really poking fun at him. The nickname Mr. Saturday, because I mean we all know what that car has and has not been capable of on a Sunday afternoon over the past couple of years since he's become a Formula One driver. But I mean his record in over the past couple of years since he's been a Formula One driver is impressive with what he's been able to do with what he's had available to him, and I think from there he does deserve the props to it.
But
Anyways, I just wanted.
I
Oh,
think
sorry.
that
Go ahead.
I'm going to counter you on that one because I think the perception is that it's an absolute dog of a car
Mhm.
But we don't actually know that. We assume it is, and everyone buys into that narrative, and it's probably true, but we don't know for certain that that's the
To what
case.
extent?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Yep, fair. I'll give you that. I think that's a great point.
We're
Before we go
such
to the
Canadians. I need to make a counterpoint, but I totally agree. We're such
yeah,
Canadians.
sorry for disagreeing with you just now, Mark. Anyways, I just wanted to dive into the live chat here because Viral Eagle has made a comment. I want to get your take on this one. And the quote is, thoughts on Mazepin having the fastest lap? Haha, just crapped off the quote unquote race. Of course, I don't think he got the half, or, well, I guess I assume they would have given a half point for fastest lap, but I don't think it would have counted because he wasn't in the top 10. But I thought of a bizarre topsy-turvy, upside-down weekend. Of course, Nikita Mazepin would have to get the fastest lap of the race. I was happy. Yeah, I was having a bit of a laugh at myself when I saw that, because they did mention it in the commentary as well. I'm just like, well, when you're living in the upside down, well, why not? I guess that it's all good. Anyways, let's take a quick break and then we'll close it down. We've got a couple more emails, so let's take a very quick break here. We'll come back on the flip side, take a couple more emails, and we'll do that in just a moment, so don't go away. All right. Well, welcome back to the show. Mark and Mark here, breaking down what really wasn't a race. But anyways, time to go on to other things. We haven't been able to get to the mailbag very much in the last couple of shows. We've been so very, very busy. So why don't we look into the mailbag? Let's see what we can find. Got one here. Oh, it's Bitter Brad in Pittsburgh.
Go!
Oh, I'm just kidding. I don't want to make fun of Brad. He's always got some good points. Always happy to hear what he has to say. Anyways, email is, hi, Marks. One last question for now. He sent us a couple, and this is a little more of a fun one. My wife and I recently rewatched the movie Talladega Nights, The Ballad of Ricky Bobby, which I love. And I come to realize that although Formula One is only briefly touched upon in the film, this was my only real touchstone for Formula One racing for a big chunk of my young adult life. Obviously, the portrayal of Sacha Baron Cohen's Jean Giraud is done more as a gag on American ethnocentrism and general attitudes towards Europeans, and particularly the French in America at the time. Just a quick question. Do we ever go back to calling them French fries, or are we still going with freedom fries? I know it's still freedom fries. Okay. Yeah. This was a post 9/11 era of freedom fries. Oh, sorry. I already I didn't read this beforehand, but apparently Brad and I are on the same wavelength. Anyways, this was still the post 9/11 era of freedom fries. If you're not with us, you're against us, and we'll put a boot in your ass. It's the American way after all. However, focusing more on the motorsport aspect of the movie, I was wondering what effect you think it had on North American attitudes towards Formula One. Racing in general is sort of treated of as a joke in this movie, and particularly the character of Giraud is shown as reading books and drinking espressos during races. Obviously, it's a satire, but as I said, many younger Americans, it was many younger Americans' only exposure to Formula One at the time, and it was portrayed as snobby, Euro elitist, and weirdly as a skill set that translates to NASCAR. Furthermore, and I thought this is where it could be interesting, Talladega Nights only came out about a year after the 2005 U.S. Grand Prix, which you've mentioned several times as an unmitigated disaster, which we did again tonight. So, for those of you keeping score, you can add that to the tally. Anyways, Brad has to finish up by saying, was that and this movie a bit of a 1-2 punch for U.S. North American attitudes towards F1 in the mid-aughts? Thanks again, Bitter Pittsburgh Brad. Yeah, great email. And I think it was a bit of a 1-2 punch. I think they definitely were poking fun at Formula One. I think that Baron Cohen really nailed the character and really played up all the stereotypes at the time, and it was satire, just as Brad points out, but I seem to remember laughing at the time. I mean, the whole movie was stupid comedy, and it was one corny joke after another, but it was enjoyable, and I had to laugh at the time too, because I thought, well, okay, they're working this angle into it, this supposedly very successful Formula One driver making this seamless jump to NASCAR and everything like that. And I think they sort of spliced in some what was it? Some pictures of some Benetton, the sort of the blue and yellow mild seven kind of Fernando Alonso era Benetton, which was kind of cool. But yeah, I think it might have been a little bit of a 1-2 punch, because I kind of always wondered that myself. I mean, it did come out not too long after that joke of a U.S. Grand Prix back in 2005. I always kind of wondered if that was done on purpose. I've never really looked into it, but that's definitely food for thought.
I am legit on Amazon.ca right now ordering the big, hairy American winning edition of Talladega Nights. I love the film. You're absolutely right. I remember it coming out in 2006. I loved it. I'm not a big slapstick, dumb comedy fan, but I really do enjoy Will Ferrell's work. And I thought that movie was fantastic. And at the time, I was a big Formula One fan. I didn't know, and I still don't know a lot about NASCAR. I think pretty much everything I know about the sport of NASCAR I learned from that film. So hopefully it stands true or was accurate to begin with. But I actually quite enjoyed the portrayal of a Formula One driver, because I don't know that it was necessarily an exaggeration on what American motorsports fans thought Formula One drivers were. In fact, I think it was probably a pretty muted representation of what North American or American motorsports fans thought F1 drivers were. And I think this is why, and I don't want to keep going back to Drive to Survive, but I think one of the reasons that Drive to Survive has been so powerful is because it unlocked the personality of the drivers. It helped to break down some of those stereotypes and make the drivers more accessible in a way that they wouldn't have been previously. Because if you don't have Drive to Survive, all you see is these guys in the bullpen getting peppered with questions before or after a race when they're not being particularly open or sincere, and they're basically trotting out the team orders or the team lines when it comes to certain questions. But I think this movie did a pretty good job of reflecting what the perception was at that time. And like I said, it was probably even a pretty muted perception. So I love the movie. I thought
Great
it was
call.
very, very well done. And I think as well, you look at the drivers at that time. For me, they weren't particularly accessible, and I didn't know a lot about them. And I found it really difficult to rally behind any of them, even as an active Formula One fan. And I think this is why I got so excited the year following when Lewis entered the sport, because I'm like, hey, this is a young guy. He's not from a super wealthy background. This is a guy that I could better connect with, probably not
Mhm.
relate with, but better connect with, and maybe relate a little bit. Having gone to a public primary school in the UK in an area that wasn't particularly affluent, but I thought this was a really well crafted email, and I loved it. So more questions about Talladega Nights.
Well, of course. So, got to start working a little bit of shake and bake into the podcast, whatever we can.
Well done.
Next email comes from Carlos in H Town, and this is a great question as well. And he's asking about the upcoming Schumacher documentary set to drop on Netflix in about 2 weeks on September 15th. And he goes on to say that he's only learned a small amount about Michael Schumacher, and he says, but it seems to be fair to classify him as a dirty driver. I'm hoping for some classification on the topic. Also, could you offer a few equivalent athletes in North American sports? He names several from the Dobler, Romanowski in the NFL, Lambier, Rasheed Wallace, Karl Malone, Dennis Rodman in the NBA, Pete Rose, Ty Cobb, and he names quite a few. He said, and of course, he said, I'm not familiar with the NHL, but I imagine there are several comparisons to be made. And yeah, I don't know. That's kind of a difficult one. I've been thinking about that, and I don't really know if there's a way to really draw specifically a non-motorsports comparison with Schumacher. I mean, it's different again because all of these guys are playing team sports, be it football, basketball, baseball, hockey, whatever. And motorsport, of course, it's a team sport, but I mean, obviously, a lot relies on the driver who's in the car. And I don't know. What do you think about this one, Mark? This one I find a little bit difficult to answer.
Oh, I really like the question. I might tap out on this one, and come back next week with some answers. I, I,
Yeah.
I think we're going to learn a lot about Schumacher, and this is one of the reasons I'm really interested or curious about that Netflix documentary. Is I want to get a sense of, I want to learn about how much they do or maybe don't sanitize his driving career. And I brought this up a couple of times in the past that I
Yeah.
think for a lot of people that are coming into Formula One, you hear about Michael Schumacher being the great. He won 7 titles. He won 5 titles with uh, with Ferrari. Then he had his Washington Wizards adventure at the end of his career with the Mercedes team, and that's a Michael Jordan reference for our non-NBA fans, who again, like Michael Schumacher, came out of retirement to go to a team that wasn't in a position to contend. I'll
Yeah.
have to come back to you on this one, but I would encourage folks that don't necessarily know to do a little bit of research into Schumacher's career, and maybe do it after you watch the documentary, because maybe this is covered. But I think it's important, and I brought this up a couple of times. This is a guy who was disqualified from the 1997 championship for
Hmm.
intentionally running into another car in the hopes of knocking that individual out of the race so he could secure himself a chip for the year. Not clean, but I'll be very, very curious in terms of sporting parallels. I think there's some good ones out there, but let me come back next week and share those.
Well, I mean, yeah, fair enough. But I mean, there is that good reason to think of him as a dirty driver. I mean, there's a lot of obvious things to talk about. There was a time he parked his car in Monaco during qualifying, which kind of
Oh,
messed up everything as
totally.
well. There's the incident with Jacques at Jerez in '97. There was the title on the line at Adelaide in '94 with Damon Hill, and that whole that was a bit shady as well. So
Totally.
it's interesting too, because we've seen the trailer for the Schumacher documentary, but I'd really like to know, that old saying, follow the money. I'd like to really know, like, you know whose idea it was, because is this going to be
Right.
like an unbiased subjective look at Michael
Right.
Schumacher, the man, the driver, his career and everything like that? And again, like, very much like you said just now when we were talking about that the whole Ricky Bobby thing and the drivers of that the early to mid aughts, and just how they, I mean, at that time we were just what limited videos we could see online on a website or in a magazine was probably the go-to thing at that time, right? I mean, compared to what we can get today, which is social media, print media, if that's still a thing, and any other digital platform that you can think of. I mean, with Schumacher, I mean, broke into Formula One in the early '90s at Spa, and I mean that was one cool thing, that his son Mick would had like the retro throwback helmet of his dad, which was kind of overlooked and all that. But I mean, this was an era where definitely you were going to magazines, and this is before the internet was really a thing. So I mean, you really weren't getting news very often, and anything that you would get would be a feature spread in a magazine, or that's basically what it came down to, or newspaper articles. So
Great point.
it'll be really, really interesting to see like a lot of this old footage, and it'll be interesting to see like these incidents with Hill, the incidents with Jacques, the whole Monaco thing, how they frame that with obviously the 2 titles at Benetton, the 5 titles at Ferrari. And I mean, sure, he really elevated and took the whole role of a Formula One driver to the next level with the fitness, the way that he worked with the team and worked with the engineers. Sure, I mean, you give him credit for all that. I mean,
Yeah.
but for all the credit and all the love that you share, or you show Michael Schumacher, you have to look at the dark with the dark side as well. So yeah, it's a great question from Carlos. I think we need to look into this one a little bit you know more. I just don't know if Schumacher was necessarily as intense as Bill Romanowski, but I love the question. Very cool. So what are we gonna do? We've got to wrap it up. I got MotoGP corner. I got it all primed and ready to go. Did I get to play it tonight? Do you want to do it, or
I'm,
did
I'm
it?
going to substitute this with Hip Hop Corner tonight, and
Oh, okay.
I just
Which I don't have a little thing primed for here in the
I
audio
know.
cart, but it's all good. It's all good.
Given the fact that I spent 18 hours prepping and building and developing the jingle for MotoGP Corner, it's been generally quite unutilized. As a hip hop fan, I want to give Kanye West flowers for finally releasing Donda last night. As it turns out, he may not have expected that he was going to release it rather Universal released it. But that's one mega album with a bunch of guest stars. And so obviously as a hip hop fan, I take notice of this. That said, I will not be listening to it until I've listened to Certified Lover Boy, Drake's new masterpiece, which will be dropping this coming Friday the 3rd, at least 100 million times, because I don't want to give Kanye too many streams in the battle for most streams of 2021. And for those of you that didn't notice, Drake effectively announced the album by quote unquote hacking into Sports Center. So during the Sports Center promo, which is where they show a bunch of clips and there's some music before they go to the host sitting at the desk, it hacked in and it showed a fan holding up a piece of cardboard that said CLB September 3rd. So I thought that was pretty cool. Not quite as extravagant as Kanye hosting 3 listening parties in front of tens of thousands of people, but effective nonetheless. So as a hip hop fan, I just wanted to share a little bit of pop culture tonight, but I don't really have a lot else. Looking through my notes again, I think the theme of the weekend was safety. I think we obviously talked about this a couple of weeks ago with Matt Sakaris, just in terms of the safety of this track. It sounds as though, and I think it's pretty well established, that there are some not insignificant changes coming to a couple of the more problematic corners that we'll probably see instituted next year, possibly more. I think Formula One's going to have some serious reflection on their hands. I think the FIA has some reflection on their hands. I think the weekend was a bad look ultimately from a safety perspective and in terms of hosting or shoving through or ramming through a farce of a 2-race spectacle. Not a good look. Let's move on. I'm excited for Zandvoort. I think the main thing is that we ultimately didn't run a Grand Prix because the conditions wouldn't allow it. No one's hurt. Obviously, we've got some drivers from the W Series that are awfully shaken up, and I think you and I were both greatly relieved they're okay. Lando's okay, but we've got Zandvoort in just a couple of days, and hopefully conditions will allow a Grand Prix, but I think that's something we should all be excited for, regardless of what happened in Belgium.
Yeah, exactly. Let's draw a line under this one. Like we say, let's hope that they do right by the fans that sat out there for 3.5, 4 hours in the rain. Not to mention all the time that took to get to the track and all that. But I'm skeptical. But let's wait and see. Anyways, that was quite the closer that you had there, Mark. I have nothing further to add, so let's get out while the going is good. Thank you guys for downloading and listening to the show. Thank you for those of you who jumped in on the live stream on YouTube tonight. If you want to get in touch, by all means do so. You can send us an email. That's still a thing in 2021. Email is scooteryf1pod@gmail.com. If you want to get in on our weekly Spaces chat, which usually goes at about 7 p.m. Pacific time, 10 p.m. Eastern, Thursday nights, you can follow us on Scootery F1 Pod. And that's it. That's a wrap. Have a great week. We'll see you in a couple of days. On behalf of myself and Mr. Mark Hamilton, bye for now.